Good evening and welcome once again to Channel 514 and SPK Plus, where we are, as usual, continuing our series exploring ancient literature. And in this episode of that series, I would like to conclude our overview of Homer's Iliad, and also announce that, thanks to GoAnimate.com, our channel will soon begin to include animated videos as well as the form of presentation that we normally use. Now, let's not waste any time here. Let's get right back into the text of the Iliad, which once again is Robert Fagel's 1990 translation, which we're using not for any particular reason, but simply because I have it ready to hand. Now, the last time, you may remember, we finished book 16. We read, or didn't read, but we discussed books 4 through 16, and so this time we will be discussing books 17 through 24, and if there are any points that I'd like to draw out afterward, or any closing thoughts that I'd like to share with you, then we will do that, but let's not waste any time and let's get right back into book 17. Now, if you remember from our last video, we left off right after Patroclus, the close friend and associate of Achilles, the champion of the Achaeans, who are attacking the city of Troy, had been killed in single combat by Hector, the leader of the Trojan forces. And in book 17, we're still at the scene of that combat in which the young Patroclus has died. And as often happens in the Iliad, there is a close and furious combat around the body of the dead man. Now, each side, the Achaeans and the Trojans, want to carry off the corpse of the dead man, and they want to take his armor and weapons and any valuables or finery that he may possess or have on his person, and of course Hector, who killed the man in the previous book, at the end of book 16, has already stripped off the armor that Patroclus was wearing, which he had himself borrowed from his friend Achilles, and Hector has put this armor on himself. So that's where we find ourselves now. So both sides are fighting over the body, and Robert Fagles, our translator, he titles this book, book 17, Menelaos' Finest Hour, because the character Menelaos, the king of Sparta and the husband of Helen of Troy, gives a good account of himself in this scene of a furious fight around the body of the slain Patroclus. Now, ultimately the Achaeans, the Greeks, are successful in gaining possession of the dead man's remains, and one of the sons of Nestor, the oldest of the Achaean chieftains, who often speaks in long monologues, one of his sons, Antilochus, runs off on his, he runs off to the tent of Achilles to inform the man that his friend has been killed. And if I remember rightly, this character Antilochus is known for being swift of foot, and so it makes sense that he would be the one to go and carry this message. Now, of course, I should make sure how far we actually get in this book, if the message actually gets delivered in this one, or if it only gets delivered in the next book. Okay, so yeah. Antilochus is dispatched to carry this message in Book 17, and in Book 18 he actually arrives at the tent of Achilles and delivers the message. Now, Book 18 is titled by Robert Fagles, The Shield of Achilles, and we'll see why that is. So, anyway, this is where Achilles is informed that his friend has been killed, and I'll take a moment to say that it's often, well, the relationship between Achilles and his friend is often interpreted as having something of the homoerotic to it, or it's often thought of as being the kind of special friendship that you would read about in later Greek authors, or that is mentioned sometimes in later Greek authors. Plato, of course, being a famous example of that. And it's sometimes said, or one way of looking at it is that Achilles, as the older character, is probably the active friend, and the younger man, Patroclus, is the passive, but I don't really think that that is ever explicitly expressed in our poem, so I guess you really have to just decide that for yourself if you really want to decide on such a thing, or anyway, it's not explicitly said here, so I guess I'll just leave that up to you, but I don't think it necessarily has to be interpreted that way, or that that's like an important theme in our story, or really anything like that. But in any case, whatever the details are, Achilles is of course grief-stricken that his friend has been killed, and so he is, well, beside himself, inconsolable, etc., etc. And so he makes the traditional display of mourning, tearing at his hair, etc., and crying out in pain. And what he does next is go to the sea, because his mother is a sea goddess, but in any case he prays to his mother, a sea goddess, and says that he now must return to the fighting and get revenge on Hector, who has killed his friend. And to do this he needs new armor and weapons, because his own have been taken by Hector, because he had lent them to his friend. And beforehand, you may remember, when the Achaeans sent an embassy to Achilles to ask him to rejoin their cause, he had said that he wanted to return to the mainland, to his home, and get away from his destiny, which was to be killed under the walls of Troy after winning great glory. So he had thought that he would forego all that glory and go home and live a long and obscure life, but now, because he wants revenge on the man who's killed his friend, he's going to go with the glory again, so he's going to let his fate or his destiny take its course, and he's going to carry it through. So, hoping, of course, that he can kill his enemy before, being killed himself, but anyway, he needs new armor and weapons to do that, and so that's why Fagles titles this book The Shield of Achilles, because Achilles' mother, the sea goddess Thetis, she goes to the smith, the blacksmith of the gods, a god himself who acts as a blacksmith, who makes all kinds of fantastical items that have special powers for the gods and for their favorites. And so he makes new armor and weapons for Achilles, including a shield, which is described in detail. I believe it's described in detail in this book and not in a later one, but of course the shield is very richly worked with all kinds of representative art So it shows different, I think, some different mythological scenes or scenes from life, like farming and harvesting and things like that. And anyway, it's very detailed, and there's a long passage where the shield is described in great detail, so we won't stop to look at that, but just be advised of that. If you want to come in for a closer look, you can do so in Book 18 of the Iliad, where the Shield of Achilles is described. And so that is an example of something you see in epic literature fairly often, where some kind of fantastically formidable or beautiful or fine or rich item is described in great details to sort of delight the imagination. Now, what else might happen? What else happens here? Well, that's the end of it anyway. At the end of this book, the goddess Thetis, Achilles' mother, she dashes back to the earth to deliver these goods to her son. And in Book 19, we find the title, The Champion Arms for Battle, so that's what Robert Fagles calls Book 19. Now, here, let's make sure that I don't miss anything important here. Well, here, of course, Agamemnon, the leader of the coalition of mainland and island Greeks who are attacking the city of Troy, and Achilles, his greatest champion and greatest asset, are finally reconciled. So in Book 1, they have a falling out, and here in Book 19, they're finally reconciled. So that's probably, to the ancients, this would have been sort of a touching scene, although it doesn't necessarily register that way with modern readers. But both of these men have seen their mistake, and so they humble themselves enough to come to terms. Now, let's see now. And of course, Achilles lets them know that he's resolved to kill his enemy, Hector, in revenge. Now, he of course wants to attack right away, to mount a large-scale attack on the Trojans right away, but they talk him into desisting from this and waiting a while. And also, as a token of reconciliation, Agamemnon returns to Achilles the slave woman that he had demanded from him in Book 1. So the slave woman actually mourns over the body of the dead Patroclus, saying that he had been kind to her, that they were friends, and so she's sad that he's dead. But anyway, that happens, and what else happens here? Actually, yeah, one interesting thing that happens at the very end of this book is that a horse actually speaks. Achilles is looking over his horses that he's going to use with his chariot as he returns to the battle, and one of them, Fagles translates the horse's name as Roan Beauty, so Roan Beauty, the horse with flashing hoofs, spoke up from under the yoke, bowing his head low so his full mane came streaming down the yoke pads, etc., etc. And apparently the goddess Hera is giving this horse the ability to speak for a short time. And it says to Achilles, "The day of death already hovers near, and we are not to blame, but a great god is, and the strong force of fate." So I've mentioned more than once before already, we have the will of Zeus moving toward its end, we have the machinations of the gods as a major theme in our story, and we also have fate, an unchangeable course of things that not even the gods can change. And so here we have them both in the very same breath. A great god is to blame for this, and the strong force of fate. So there you go. Now, Achilles, of course, is sort of crestfallen or nonplussed when he hears this horse speak, and not only speak, but tell him about his own death. So, anyway, that's where we're at now. So, Book 20 is called here by Fagles Olympian Gods in Arms, and I'm guessing that the reason that he calls it that is that the gods now return to the battle. So previously Zeus had forbidden his fellow Olympian gods to interfere in what was going on under the walls of Troy, and had done all the interfering himself, or at least had guided the course of things himself. And now that's all done with, so they can go back and they can come back down and help their favorites and fight among themselves and interfere in things like they usually do. So there we are. Now, let's see. And of course they go right ahead and do that, and they come to grips with each other as the book goes on. But anyway, one other interesting thing that happens here is that Achilles meets Aeneas in battle. So as we mentioned, I believe in the video right before this one, Aeneas, the hero of Virgil's Aeneid, of course, who is believed to have been an ancestor of Rome's Julian clan, the family of Julius Caesar and the emperors, etc. So Aeneas is introduced, or appears in literature for the first time, in one of the earlier books of the Iliad. I believe it was book 4 or 5, but anyway, he's introduced there, and so we meet him again here. He pops up here and there throughout the story, but we meet him again here where he engages in combat with Achilles. And of course, being a brave man, Aeneas isn't about to be cowed by Achilles, but of course no one can stop this guy now, so Aeneas that is, ends up having to be spirited away by the god Poseidon, the sea god, at the last minute so that he won't be killed. And of course Achilles is furious over this because his enemy has suddenly disappeared in a cloud of dust before his eyes, but there's nothing he can do about it. And so he knows, I think, at that point that the gods are interfering with his work, but he continues on the warpath, and he kills many of the Trojans and sort of rampages among them. And I believe at the end of this book, he's pursuing a party of a rabble, so to say, of fleeing Trojans towards a river. And what river is that? Because it does have a name. I believe it's the one that our poet calls Scamander, and when he mentions it, often he mentions, for some reason, I don't know why this is, but that the gods call this river the Xanthos, Xanthus or Os, whereas mortals call it Scamander. So I don't know why that is, but probably I could look that up, and there is a perfectly good answer for that, but it always has struck me as odd or curious anyway. But there we are. So Achilles is killing these men in the river. They're wading, splashing around in the river. He's killing them, and the river is getting all full of blood, so the river god, because the Greeks tended to believe that each river had a god that inhabited it and had some control over it, and was even somehow identified with it. The god of the river is upset by this, and so he tries to bear down on and crush and drown and overwhelm Achilles. So somehow I think one of the other gods intervenes to stop that from happening, because of course that's not the will of Zeus, and that's not fate that should happen. But for a moment it looks like Achilles, after making such a hue and cry, is about to be killed by a river rather than some other hero or someone. So, of course, he finds that very troubling or very ignominious and tragic. So, but he's saved from the river. And let's see, what else goes on in this book? Well, finally, the Trojans are put to flight in Book 21. Achilles fights the river. So Fagles calls Book 22 the death of Hector, so you can guess what's going to happen here. So anyway, all the Trojans have fled back into their city behind its lofty walls, so the only one left outside is Hector, and I believe that's because he's waiting for this decisive confrontation with Achilles, and by now he has a pretty strong foreboding that he will be the one to be killed. Now, let's see. So Achilles rushes toward the walls of Troy, looking for his enemy, and there's a very tragic scene when the two of them finally meet. Now, okay. Well, Athena, anyway, the goddess Athena, this warlike goddess, a patroness of citadels and of the sanctity of a society and of a city-state. One would think that she would be helping the people who are defending their city-state in this case, but she's not. She's helping Achilles, so she appears to him. I'm not sure, and it would probably take too long to actually verify one way or another if she's appearing to him as who she is, or as one of the Greeks or something like that, but she tells him that she'll help him, and so they go to confront Hector. And here there's a scene where Hector panics and flees from Achilles, and he runs around the walls of the city. I think he runs around the walls 3 times, and of course his family members are up on the walls urging him to come inside, but he's not going to do that, so he runs around the city wall, and finally Athena appears to him disguised as one of his brothers, Deiphobos, and she tells him that they'll take on Achilles together. So you can see how really sick and cruel that is. She's going to give him this really tragic false hope here. And so she says, "Come, let us stand our ground together, beat him back." And Hector says, "Dearest of all brothers, etc., now I'm determined to praise you all the more, you who dared, seeing me in these straits, to venture out from the walls, all for my sake, while the others stay inside and cling to safety." So back they go to where Achilles is waiting to have this final confrontation. And so, as they meet again, Hector bravely challenges his foe, and he tries to get him to agree to a pact that whichever one kills the other, if that should happen, that one will not mutilate the remains of his enemy or refuse to return them to his enemy's family or companions, but Achilles says, "Don't talk to me of pacts, there are no binding oaths between men and lions, etc., etc. So, no truce till one or the other falls and gluts with blood Ares, who hacks at men behind his rawhide shield, so no deal, anyway." Now, let's see. So Achilles hurls his spear and misses, but Achilles returns the spear to him. And Hector calls out to his brother, really Athena, whom he thinks is helping him, but he finds that no one's there anymore. The man was nowhere near him, vanished. Yes, and Hector knew the truth in his heart, and the fighter cried aloud, "My time has come! At last the gods have called me down to death. I thought he was at my side, the hero Deiphobus. He's safe inside the walls. Athena's tricked me blind. And now death, grim death, is looming up beside me, no longer far away. No way to escape it now. This was their pleasure, after all, sealed long ago. Zeus sent the son of Zeus, the distant deadly archer, though often before now they rushed to my defense." So, he's realized that the gods have been tricking him all this time, so you may remember, if you've seen the previous video, that there are parts where there's one part in particular where he says that he trusts in the will of mighty Zeus, and I pointed out that's the one thing that he can't trust at all. I mean, you can trust almost anything more than that, because the will of Zeus is what's leading him to this point at which he finds himself now. So, finally that becomes clear. So, there's that theme in our story that I'm most interested in drawing out. The will of Zeus was moving toward its end. So, the gods afflict man, and there you have it. Now, Hector, of course, is resolved not to go without a struggle, and so he tries to fight back, but he's killed. And so Achilles then gloats over his enemy's body and attaches it. He pierces the dead man's feet and attaches the body to his own chariot and drives around the walls and mocks the Trojans who are watching from the walls, including the family of Hector, his father and mother, etc. So now, after this, Achilles returns to his camp, returns to the Greek camp, and in Book 23, there's an episode of funeral games. So Achilles holds funeral games for Patroclus, and he awards prizes to the victors, etc., etc. So all of the major Achaean characters, all of their chieftains and kings and leaders, they all take part in these funeral games and compete with each other, and so all of their characters come out, so to speak. The idioms and the traits of the characters come out in the way they compete in the events and the rivalries between them, etc. So that's the funeral games. Now, meanwhile, Achilles is continually outraging the body of his enemy, Hector. So he's really become this inhuman character, especially since returning to the fight. So, coming in with new armor from the gods and everything, he's almost too godlike and too glorious and too inhuman. And so that's really, now the shine has sort of worn off, and this inhumanity is sort of eating away at him, and so it's a very gruesome scene that we find, a very unpleasant and unsettling picture in which Achilles is continually dragging his foe's remains behind his chariot and tumbling it in the dust, etc. So things don't look good. Now, the only solution, or the only way out at this point for Achilles, is for him to return Hector's body to Troy. So he refuses to do this, and so it seems like we're stuck here with the wrath of Achilles, So he's killed all these people and, won great glory and everything, but he can't get over this wrath and this inhumanity. But one of the gods, I think it's Apollo, comes to the king of Troy, Priam, and he tells him that he'll help him get into the Greek camp, sneak into the Greek camp, which of course you'd think the king of the other side would not want to sneak into his enemy's camp, So that's what they do. So the god, I forget which god is involved, Apollo or Hermes, Apollo and Hermes, I should look that up, but they get into the camp and suddenly there's the king of Troy right there in Achilles' tent, begging him to finally relent and give up on his grudge, let death settle everything, and give the dead man's remains back to his family. And so Achilles at first is aware that if this old man vexes him and reproaches him too strongly, that he might just lose his temper and kill the man, and so he urges Priam not to push his luck or not to try his patience. But of course, having made this trip, Priam is begging and humbling himself before his son's killer in hopes that there can be some reconciliation or a temporary peace, or that at least they can recognize each other as men, as human beings in the face of death and tragedy, etc., and that this man won't just kill the old king just out of rage or spite or whatever, or won't refuse his request and send him back empty-handed. But anyway, finally Achilles does give in, and so there's a moment in which the two of them do come to a realization, or do just share a few moments together as human beings and get past everything that is between them that would be an obstacle to that. So the king of Troy then returns to, well, I should say one of the things that helps bring this about, of course, is that the king of Troy is an old man who has many sons, many of whom have been killed at this point, and Achilles himself hasn't seen his own father in many years because he and the other Greeks have been on the plain of Troy for a long time now, for 9 years, according to our poets. So he hasn't seen his father, and he won't see him again, of course, because he knows he's going to be killed. So there's sort of a strange father-son moment between the two of them, anyway. And Priam then returns to Troy with his son's body, and the epic ends with the Trojans having a funeral for Hector. So let's see if there's anything else really to point out here. And of course something probably will occur to me after I'm all done with this, but we'll just do the best we can here now. Of course, so Hector is mourned over by his wife and by his parents, and they all have something to say individually about him. And so there's weeping and wailing, and I believe they burn his remains on a large barrow or on a pyre, and then he's buried in a barrow in a grave mound. And so our last few lines here, 940 and following, and once they'd heaped the mound, they turned back home to Troy, and gathering once again they shared a splendid funeral feast in Hector's honor, held in the house of Priam, king by the will of Zeus. And so the Trojans buried Hector, breaker of horses. I had forgotten about that last bit, Priam, king by the will of Zeus, and I think that's an interesting thing, since the will of Zeus is my pet theme in this overview of the Iliad. That's an interesting thing to end on, really, that as all this has been going on, Priam is king by the will of Zeus, but of course we know what's going to happen if he's not going to be king much longer, so I mean, he himself, according to the overall Trojan cycle in heroic mythology, he's killed as the city falls, and so there's not going to be a city much longer, and there's not going to be a King Priam much longer, but anyway, at this moment he's king by the will of Zeus. And so the will of Zeus was moving toward its end, and that would make up our summary of the Iliad here on channel 514. So there you have it. We've done it from books 1 to 24. Now, from here, of course, there's nowhere to go but right on into the Odyssey, and after that we'll treat the Homeric hymns, and then we'll move on to Hesiod and other early Greek writers. But anyway, let's see if there's anything else at all that I should mention before closing up shop here. Well, once again, look out for our animated videos, courtesy of GoAnimate.com, which will be coming your way pretty soon. I don't know exactly when, but it'll take me a while, but, pretty soon. So thanks anyway. Thanks to everyone who has taken this little trip through Homer so far with us, and take care, of course, and have a great weekend, as it's Friday tomorrow and everything. So I hope your month of October is off to a great start, and we will be seeing you soon. So have a good one, and thanks again.